What we've got here is failure to communicate.
From sunny Southern California, we bring you Meet Bridget, a podcast for building confident communication and female badassery. We spotlight women who have bridged the gaps in their lives by building strong relationships and speaking their teenage dreams into reality.
Too much positivity is incredibly toxic, and just like in any other avenue, especially when it comes to body positivity, I think it's like, so there's two sides to this coin, right?
All right, welcome back to Meet Bridget. We've missed you all, and we're excited to be back for season 3. As a little heads up, this is a 2-part episode. Keshiia and I got to talking on the topic of body image, and the conversation was long and windy and interesting, and we decided to break it up into 2 episodes. So please enjoy part 1 of body image.
Welcome back to Meet Bridget. Keshiia here. I am the COO and co-host of the Meet Bridget podcast. Together with my best friend and partner, Asha Gabriel, I help run a confidence and communication platform for teen girls called Bridget. This season 3, by the way, woo, we are looking to do things a little differently. Though we loved our bridge etymology episodes last season and season 1, where we break down words to get to their meanings as it applies to daily life, we heard from our audience that they wanted more candid conversations between Asha and I. And honestly, I don't blame them. We are back today for our first one-on-one episode of the season, and we thought we'd kick it off with a little discussion on body image. And Asha, it feels so good to be back on the mic with you.
I know, I
I'm
love
like geeking
this.
out right now.
It's so funny because some of you know that we work with a lot of girls, and we have worked with a lot of girls in person, and some, members of our community that know us and have seen us interacting with each other, and are just our like conversations and stuff have told us, they're like, "What, you guys should just put that on the podcast because it's fun, and we derive so much meaning from our relationship with each other and working together and focusing on these topics that are just so, they're so central to the lives of young women, but, women of all ages. So, yeah, so that's what we're doing. So, welcome back. So, most of you know that Quiche really recently had a baby, and I just had my second baby just 3 months before her. And, as women, whether we bear children or not, as our bodies grow, bloom, transform, and change with hormones and age, we felt inspired to dedicate this episode to the journey of how we relate to our bodies over time. As a little disclaimer, we will likely be candidly discussing issues including body dysmorphia, eating disorders, depression, thyroid cancer, pregnancy, and pregnancy loss. Should any of these things be triggering to you at this time, please feel free to sit this episode out or see our show notes for resources. Additionally, this conversation is sourced and biased by our personal experiences as cis women. As always, however, we welcome all identities and ages to our audience. Our hope is that if you find yourself in any of the stages discussed, you won't feel alone. So, welcome to our Meet Bridget community, longtime and new listeners. Today, we're going to kind of riff, and go through topics all around body image. Personally, this is something that has been part of my life and struggle, like from the very beginning. So we'll kind of
Same.
see where the conversation goes. We're talking about this episode, and there's so much here. So
This is such a timely episode for you and I personally because we've
yes,
gone through so many changes within the last 2 to 3 years. And on top of that, it's, a conversation that continues to be not just pop, but like, relevant at any state because people are always talking about what other people look like.
yeah, and I think as women too, like people are always talking about what women look like. There's just such a
Mhm.
fixation. I'm not to discount that, like, plenty of men have body image issues and things going on, but from our experience, as women, it's just I especially noticed that, like, there is this crazy fixation on the changes in women's bodies, why not they're not a certain shape or they're not staying this certain way forever. I mean, I guess we could start with what is body image actually? We pulled a definition for body image that we can read just to kind of frame the conversation. So, Body image is a combination of the thoughts and feelings that you have about your body. Body image may range between positive and negative experiences, and one person may feel at different times positive or negative or a combination of both. It's influenced by internal, like your personality, and external, like social and environmental factors. So it's kind of a bland definition of body image, but I think it's so tied to how we feel, what we do every day, and it starts somewhere. So when would you say you first became like self-aware or body conscious when, when you looked in the mirror and you realize like, "Oh, this is,
I mean, you become aware of your body at such a young age, right? Like, my son is, like, 6 months old, and, like, you see at this stage developmentally, like and I'm sure you realize this with your girls too, like, they're noticing their hands, their feet, like, they're fascinated. And I think for me, like, the interesting part of this conversation, because I have, this history, I'll just be really candid, and I think I've mentioned this in some of our other shows, but, like, I've had this history of body dysmorphia. So whenever I think about that, I think about where that stemmed from and, like, where I made the switch between just, like, recognizing, like, my hands and my feet, my shoulders, my thighs, and, like, all of a sudden, attributing negative or positive emotions to that. Probably middle school, like when you start coming
yeah,
into your secondary sexual characteristics, but even before that, like my mom is a beautiful woman, and I know that that's something that was really highlighted for me, by other people, by, my dad. And so there was always like this innate knowledge that like my mom had this quality of being a beautiful woman. And so as a little girl, I remember thinking like, "Oh, I want to be like my mom. I want to look like my mom." I watched how she did her makeup. That was a very significant part of like my childhood core memory package, It's just watching my mom do all of that stuff. So I was definitely aware of what it meant to be beautiful just in the context of life. And then naturally, you go through those really awkward phases. At least I did. I had like a super awkward phase of the puffy hair, the glasses, the rolly backpack, which isn't part of me physically, but it added to the it added to that awkward phase. And I remember thinking at that time, that was like 7th grade, and I was like, "Oh, this feels not very, like,
yeah.
graceful or pretty." So and then, there's a little bit of bullying and stuff, and so you really are like, "Oh, man, now that must be true about me." But what about you?
I mean, I look at my daughters and it's so fascinating, because I think there's kind of two stages of like body awareness. It's like when a baby first looks in the mirror, it's pure joy. They see themselves in the mirror and that's all they want to look at. They look kind of between you and but they're focused on their own face. And even like Eden, my 2-year-old, she looks at pictures of herself and she puffs up her chest and she literally goes, "This Eden," And that sense of identity, it's really beautiful to watch. But, I mean, I think even at that age, at early ages, I mean, this isn't something we can avoid either. It's like,
Yeah.
at some point, we look at our peers, we look at our family, we look at our parents, and we compare ourselves situationally to the people that we're around. And I think that as soon as those comparisons start happening, first, some could be just completely inconsequential and not causing any kind of damage or, negative perceptions, but we start kind of defining like, okay, how are we in relation to others? And I
Mhm.
think that it's fascinating because, when we're talking about this, I'm trying to think of like one moment where it was like I was suddenly aware of my body. But I
Yeah.
think it is more these little like
Like,
flashes, where
happens
it's
in
like, oh,
stages.
exactly. I had an older sister growing up, and so it's like there's kind of that foil going on where it's like, okay, like we're so similar, but we're different. Grew up as a ballet dancer, which I think that when I look at my body control and fitness and abilities and stuff, like dance helped me in so many ways, and in confidence in a lot of
Mhm.
ways. But, as a dancer, you're training and you're looking at the mirror and you're trying to match your alignment to all the other girls in the rhythm and everything. Like you're trying to make everything look the same and you're wearing tights and a leotard, So
Yeah.
I remember having moments like, oh, like my body is a little bit longer here and like not as flat here, a little bit, you know, bonier here than these other girls, and what does that mean? You
Yeah.
know? Or I just have this funny memory as, like, because 'cause I'm very tall. I mean, for those of you that don't know, I'm, like, on the very tall end, and Keisha's on the shorter end. You're
I'm on the very short end.
I'm 6 feet, and Keisha, how tall are you?
I'm
I was
5 feet. There's a
5 feet.
full 12 inches between
Full
us.
but, like, there is no distance in this friendship.
No, no, no
No.
distance.
Um, I had this thought. I vividly remember thinking this. I was sitting on my twin bed in the shared bedroom with my sister, and this was before the internet. Ages me a little bit, but, like, before we were able to, like, search things that we could do, surgeries and stuff. I remember sitting on my bed and thinking, like, maybe I can ask my parents to get me a surgery where they cut my calf bones down so
Oh
my
my g
legs won't go long. I literally was like, it was just when I was starting to feel like I was taller than the boys,
Yeah,
uh, like, my pants were always short, and I was just so self-conscious of that I remember kinda thinking, I'm like, "There must be a surgery. I know there's surgeries like this, like, that would solve everything." And now I think about that, I'm like, "Oh my god, like, that would be awful. That would
horrendous.
be awful." And, like, I love my legs, and they're a unique part of me, and, like, but there's these little moments and glimpses of, like, how you related through comparison to the
Mhm.
people around you.
Well, and I really love that you bring that up too because, I mean, humans are social animals. First of all, I have never believed in that more than I have after having Jude, my son. Just as a quick aside, the first time I left the house after having Jude, I, like, went to the pharmacy and I was like, "Oh, I'm just gonna go sneak out while he's napping and go pick up a prescription." And I'm, like, 1 month postpartum, and a baby starts crying, and in my head, I was like, "Oh my god, is my son thinking about me right now?" Because I got this, like, tingle, and I was like, "I must have, like, this new mommy sense." And I look down and I'm literally just gushing milk because this child is crying in the pharmacy, like, rows over, and I remember thinking, like, is there no better proof that humans are social animals than, like, one woman lactating at the sound of another woman's child crying? And
Amen.
so but this is, like, a perfect example, like, we're social animals and we're built for community, and I think, that's kind of our bread and butter with the Bridget community. But it also attributes to this natural desire to compare ourselves to other people because that's how we would have survived in the wild.
You think of, like, the ways that we used to live and migrate, in communities and tribes,
Mhm.
that comparison is essential to survival. It's like, okay, like,
You
what
need
do
to
we
fit in.
eat? Yeah,
Yeah.
like, where do we go? Who do I follow? How do I build shelter? It's like it is a primal thing, and it's not all bad. It's not like people are like, I do love that quote, like, comparison is the thief of joy. And I try to remind myself that it's like the wrong kind of comparison is a very slippery slope, but it's
Mhm.
also essential to how we live, and it's impossible to, like, live in a vacuum and be like, "Alright, I will exist by myself, and I will be so happy," because it's like these social connections bring us joy, and I think that's why we'll get more into, like, the social media conversation because I think that's so tied in right now with how everybody kinda is dealing with body image and
Yeah.
self-esteem. But, I think that that's why it's such a hard thing for most of us because social media is not all bad. Like, we are able to connect with others. I mean, we've both experienced, like, motherhood just because of the demands can be very isolating. So it's like while there are images and things on Instagram that, like, you know, may make us feel worse about ourselves or whatever, it's been a nice place to be able to connect with other mothers and other people going through similar things that we do. So, yeah, that comparison piece I think is
I think
a
it's significant. Yeah, I think it's significant. I point that out because I think the overarching theme is like we have to be graceful with ourselves. So it's, through the context of this conversation, it's very natural to compare yourself to another person. Like it's something that exists within each of us. I'd be lying if we didn't say we compared ourselves to each other all the time.
just
Most of the
did.
time it's in jest. Yeah,
Yeah.
because we describe ourselves as, like, tall friend, short friend, and, like, it would be
Yeah.
impossible not to if you saw us in person, just
Yes.
impossible. cutest pictures ever, but you have to do it with like a wide lens. That's definitely a part of the conversation. But I mean, going back to those early years of really starting to compare yourself to your peers, I mean, we're no longer living in the wild. So we've got to be real about the fact that like differences are plentiful and, we should be embracing them. But when you're in junior high, high school, and you're trying to figure out who you are and you realize that you're quite different from other people in so many ways, I think for me, that's where I started to think, maybe this doesn't look quite right, or maybe I'm not as tall as this person. And then there was definitely a component of bullying where other people would tell me like, "Oh, you're too short," or your hair is too thick, or that looks crazy. And then, there were also people that said really nice things. But, I think at that age, the things that are really mean and hurtful, those are the things that stick with you for a little bit longer at that time. I also went to a school in high school, like right in those critical years, that was primarily Caucasian. And so there were not very many people that look like me. And I think that exacerbated just this feeling of being so different. And sometimes it felt really cool. Like I was thinking about this the other day. I had a teacher who did one of those like little personality quizzes for the class. And I don't remember everything about it, but one of the things that she brought up was like, how do you walk across a room? Do you walk across a room like shuffling with your head down? Do you walk across a room with wide, boundful steps with your chin up? And I remember at the time she actually called me out and she was like, "Keshiia, I know that you have to select the one where you walk with like those big wide steps with your chin up smiling because every time I look across the quad, that's what I see you doing."
Aw.
And so when I think about that now, I'm like, "Oh, I'm glad to see that there were moments where I didn't feel so confident. At least, from the outside or in those moments, there were still moments where I was just, blissfully unaware and happy and confident in my step and stature."
I love that image of you, and it's interesting because 'cause I'm kinda just sitting here thinking about, like, in this process where we are growing and changing and interacting socially with other people, like, throughout that process, we are getting feedback from other people, from how we feel about ourselves, from how other people feel about us, from the mirror, from photos, but all of those little things are, like, isolated moments in time,
Mhm.
and kind of expect, like, okay, if that's how I looked right then, or that's what that person said about me in that exact moment, you kinda incorporate it into what you have as this, like, identity that, like, regardless of how much it's updated, it can never actually be, like, accurate. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
That, like, it's a compendium of all these different if I think of even, like, okay, how would I describe my body? Like, the images that come to mind are, like, static images from all different times of my life, you know what I mean? Or,
Mhm.
like, the most recent image. I think that's why I feel like most of the time when you hear someone describe themselves and how they look and how they kind of feel about themselves, I feel like the majority of people, or at least in my experience, like when I hear someone explain how they feel about themselves, I'm like, wow, you really don't have the full like image, do you? Like you are so much better than that. Like you did this, but you forgot this magical part about like the way that you laugh and this thing and that like so we can only have this like little partial
Little
uh
snippets.
yeah, it's like like a collage, like with
Yeah.
all these like images and it's like what this moving, changing, evolving being. I feel like we can never really have a full feedback, loop of who we are. So it's maybe almost like kind of like letting go of that need to really have that sense too. I don't know.
I was always fascinated for that exact reason with, like, home videos, growing up
Yeah.
because that was, like, the only way to really I mean, now you have reels and stuff and, so, there's a little bit more access, but I always felt like I never photographed well, like, I would tell people, like, "Oh, I just, like, don't look good in photos." I still feel that way, but that might not be true. That's just how I feel. But like I used to love looking at home videos because I'd be fascinated, like, wow, that's actually very different from how I see myself. Like, even when I'm just looking in the mirror, because when you're looking in the mirror, you're actively being biased. But like if you look at a picture, you're like, that's a moment in time. And then if you look at a video of yourself, you're like, wow, that's what I look like when I'm moving and talking and there's like sound things
Yeah.
going on, and, like, that was, like, the realest you get to, like, an out of body experience, and, like, having that experience of seeing yourself like another person would see you.
It's funny because I also think, I mean, we're both married, and I feel like I could identify any part of my husband's body blind, like, and honestly, it's like, obviously, I'm in love with my husband
Yeah.
and obsessed with him, but, like, when I think about his body, I'm never criticizing any little part of his body. I
Mhm.
feel like, it's loving, but it's also neutral,
Yeah.
like, that's what his toe looks like. But I feel sometimes like I know his body sometimes better than I think I even objectively have ever known mine.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, just thinking about this, that it's like, how weird is that? But it's like, but what you like you were saying is like watching videos of yourself or seeing like a photo here and there, and sometimes it's like, oh, what, like to be surprised by like a video of yourself. I'm like, I live in this body. Like, why am I surprised
Yeah.
at like how I look there? It's like, and the people who are so close to you, it's like you could know their body and how it looks from every angle, and it's just like you're at peace with it.
Yeah. Well, conversely too, it's so weird because, like, when I brought up so it's so when you said I know my husband's body blind, I just, like, always think about this mole on Kevin's leg that, like, one of his friends early on was like, "Have you seen the raisin that Kevin sat on as a kid?" And I was like, "What?" And, like,
Yeah.
it's whatever. Just total non sequitur. But anyways, I also love my husband, also obsessed with him. His raisin-shaped mole is neutral, whatever.
Right? Like, it's just like, don't hate on it. I mean, I've definitely focused on all these different little parts,
Yeah.
never in the same way that, like, there's been so many different things, but I feel like, you and I have talked about, like, body dysmorphia before.
Mhm.
I think both of us have struggled with it in different ways. I think this is a good time to plug our episode number 14 with
Yes.
Lara Reaves Mofidi, who is an eating disorder specialist. But we talked a lot in detail about body dysmorphia and eating disorders in that episode. But I think a big part of it is this like hyperfixation on certain areas and flaws of your body. And it's
Mhm.
interesting because it's different for each person. Like, I feel like for me, through the years, I've always been more focused on like my midsection than
Mhm.
like I don't really pay that much attention to, like, my arms or, my legs that much. Like, I bruise a lot, so I get, like, hyper fixated when I'm like, "Damn it, another bruise," and, like, "This looks so bad in pictures?" But I'm definitely more, like, hyper fixated, like, on my abs, where I talked to another girl recently, and she was like, "Oh, I'm, like, hyper fixated on my butt, like, how my butt
Mhm.
looks and everything." She's like, "I was talking with my therapist, and we're trying to, like, put a block over that area when I look in the mirror and try to, like, focus on and appreciate other areas of my body that just, like, don't get the positive or negative attention that, like, this hyperfixated little area does."
Yeah. I mean, I completely agree. I go through phases too. I mean, with body dysmorphia through the years, I think my big thing is I've just never recognized, like, it's so funny. I like have this activity now that I do only with Cara, my sister, and my husband, because it's so personal and, like, almost embarrassing. But with body dysmorphia, like, I would look in the mirror or I'd look at a picture and I would not, like, literally just would not see the picture as, like, an objective face value picture. I'd be, like,
Mm.
fixated on, like, one portion of my body, like you mentioned, or I'd be like, "Oh, this doesn't look right, this doesn't look right," or I generally feel like I look like I'm, like, 20 pounds heavier than I actually am. I don't remember when we started doing this, but I'd start, like, looking at, like, bodies of different women, like, beautiful women, like, every shape and size, and I'd, like, point out the pictures where I'd be like, "I think this is what I look like," and I swear to you, like, 9 times out of 10, my husband and Carl will be like, "No, that's actually not what you look like," and it's just so interesting because I wasn't doing it to compare myself to them, but to kind of demonstrate to them, like, what I see versus what other people see, and it was a really interesting experiment that was very actually eye-opening to me because I was, like, very, very dead set on, like, this is what I see, so that has to be true. Whereas, like, I'd show it to, my family members that I know are not gonna lie to me, and they'd just be like, "No, that's not accurate." But, yeah, so body dysmorphia has been crazy, and I think that over time, like, as we've gotten older, as I've gotten older, you develop tools to deal with it, and, like, doing things like that have kind of helped me out of it. I love that example of just like covering up one section to like look at another and appreciate it. But I mean, even today, I went to a Pilates class for the first time. I went to Megaformer for the first time since I was pregnant with Jude. And so my body obviously looks quite different 6 months postpartum than I did when I was, like, 8 months pregnant on the reformer, which was very different from being not pregnant, before that. But I, like, had a moment today where I was like, "You know what? My abs look really good." They don't look the same as they did before I had my baby or when I was pregnant with my baby, but, like, I can still see some definition there, and, like, I also see, like, the curve where I carried my son for 9 months, and, like, I see that my arms look different and that, like, my body's changed a little bit. But the other thing that I've, like, started telling myself is, like, especially having gone through that wave of not pregnant, 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 our bodies fluctuate so much to accommodate whatever we need at the time. Just like you like hold more water and weight when you're stressed, it's adaptive. Just like, you gain like bit of weight like when you're pregnant, like it's all for, to make a home for your baby. And so I've been practicing actively how to be graceful in that way and just kind of
Yeah.
like accept that there's a flow to it.
I think that's one of my favorite things about like yoga is that in all these different poses, it kind of forces you to like have awareness of like the different areas. You're in a new pose. It's like, okay, like that one was like, it was really like my forearms are like lit up. I'm like, oh, and like I'm able to move them that way. And then like, oh, here it's like, oh, it's really demanding on my core. And like, oh, wow. And you can kind of be surprised by like, oh man, like my ankles really had me in that moment. And like we're able to be stable, whatever it was. And I feel like I mean, personally, so I grew up as a dancer and then went to college. And in college, I actually went to my first yoga class with a competitive figure skater. And she knew that I had started modeling at the time and that, I was working out and had been a dancer before. She's like, I do yoga to like, stay in shape. She's like, will you go to these classes with me? And for me, it was like when I discovered yoga, I was like, oh, this is like all the good stuff from dance, all the like confidence and breathing and body expression because I, as a child, had a lot of difficulty with vocal expression. I was very quiet and reserved as a child. But like with dance and yoga, then later I was like, oh, like this is like body expression, which is so freeing. But, anyways, like I was like, but most of the yoga classes have no mirror and you're not looking at anyone else's mat, or at least it's better if you're not. And you're literally just looking inward and it's just this like examination and appreciation of all the different parts of your body and how they can move,
Mhm.
you know? So in a positive light, I mean, we want to talk about like body image and some of the like difficult things about it, but I think it's fun to like weave in tools and things that have helped us in this over time. Also, it's also a reminder that it's like we're both in our 30s. I've had two babies, Keisha's had one baby, and like this is still something we deal with. Like I actively work with a therapist, and a recurring theme that we go through is, my relationship to my body and my ability to control how it looks aesthetically and, how that's been impacted by dance, by modeling, by childbearing, by all these different things. So it's a work in progress for anyone that's listening that's like, oh, like this is a show about like, we figured it out and here we're going to give you advice. It's not
Yes.
the
Oh, no,
case.
no, 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 no. My dad used to say there's like a reset button, when you're like
Yeah.
actively doing therapy well. He's like, the way to know that you're doing it right is that when you wake up the next day and feel like you have to hit the reset button, like that's about right. Because
Yeah.
every day is a new day and a new opportunity to learn and grow and remind yourself that like it's very easy to slip into like old thought patterns. Like some of it's adaptive, just like comparison. But that doesn't mean that it's right or that it's the truth. And so part of like working on this is like daily taking up the practice of gratitude and of being like, yeah, today might be a tougher day. Today I might like really not think I look good or I don't feel good or I don't feel right. So like how do I reframe that and remind myself of the positive side of this? But we're under no illusion that this is a walk in the park or just like that we've like reached the end of a journey as like victors. I think it's a lifelong path. Speaking of
Yeah.
lifelong paths, though, I mean, we've been through so much in the last God, like I just feel like the better part of this decade together as best friends. And one of like the things that's happened throughout time is like both of us have been met with challenges physically that we've had to grow and adapt to. And I think it really has changed and forced us to evolve the way that we think about ourselves and our relationships to our bodies. I mentioned a little bit about my body dysmorphia. For those of you who've listened to some of our earlier episodes, you might know that I've had pregnancy loss and I have PMDD, which is, anxiety and depression, which is linked to your hormonal changes, like as a woman. So my anxiety and depression has fluctuated in the past along with like my menstrual patterns and hormonal patterns. And then, of course, pregnancy and motherhood. I mean, so we can talk about all of that. And Asha, you've been really, really open about your thyroid cancer diagnosis. And would you agree? Like, it's just really like these things
Yeah,
have really changed us.
I can definitely personally say that, like, my perception of my body in the different stages of my life have been incorporated into my personality, and I think that some of these big experiences created shifts in that perception of my body. I mean, like when I was a very young girl, I was often, told in supermarkets and stuff, or my mother was told, like, oh, wow, like this little girl should be a model, or like, oh, she's so beautiful, or so thin, or this and that from a young age. And it's like, obviously, it's like a nice thing to hear. Like, it's
Mhm.
better than being like, oh, look at this, like, ugly child or something. But that informed, my thought process of myself. It was like, "Oh, I have to impress people in this way," or "This is a part of what is good about me is how I look,"
Mhm.
and then getting older and, in a more negative way, it was like, being taller than the boys during part of school or lanky and this and that, or first starting to realize like, "Oh, like, we didn't really do a lot of like diet and exercise for aesthetics, in my family. Like I was never told to like work out and do certain things. Like we were all in sports and activities and stuff, but then that was like a different phase where I was like, oh, like I can manipulate how I look, by what I do day to day. That was like a discovery in high school for me. And then getting to college, I had the opportunity to start modeling, and then that became a whole new kind of phase where it was like, okay, like I can make money by keeping my body looking, a certain way
Mhm.
and walking the runway alongside a bunch of other people that are, objectively supposed to be the very same size as me, but we're all different colors, and from different places. But here we are all together because we are all the exact same size. That was a whole like
Yeah.
experience. Had positives and negatives. I'm like, when I was walking the runway, I felt like this goddess, and I was
Mhm.
able to like take on the music and the clothes. But like at that stage of my life, like clothes fit like, it was kind of like a hanger. So it's like clothes fit like loosely and it's very like fashion and like edgy and moody,
Mhm.
And I kind of took that on in my personality a little bit. I mean, after high school and like moving through different jobs and everything, I think that eventually, my thyroid issues started emerging. So I had Hashimoto's for about 6 years. And I even remember like talking with my thyroid doctor, and I was starting to experience like my skin was changing and different things were changing. Like I saw it in the mirror and how I felt. I was like, I feel different. And my doctor at the time was like, you're fine, you're really thin, you don't have most of the, like, the symptoms of being hypothyroid, so, like, you haven't gained excessive weight or any of these things that lots of people deal with, like, so you're fine. Don't worry about it, just take your medication. That same doctor missed my thyroid cancer that was eventually caught later.
Oh my god.
Um, a doctor that wasn't making, like, assumptions based on how I looked externally. So, I don't know, I feel like I'm, like, long and winding, but I try to
No, I
illustrate that.
mean, but yeah, this is like the journey though. These are like your
Yeah, like
early experiences, like informed the way that you acted, not acted, but like
totally.
how you reacted, how you dealt with some of these situations.
Well, and how you kinda, like, incorporate what your body looks like and how your body feels into your personality, and,
Mhm.
like, how you approach the world too. And I think for me, like, thyroid cancer was obviously, like, a shocker, and I had to deal with a lot of those feelings of, like, my body has betrayed me, or I thought I was taking good care of my body and keeping it in shape by yoga and diet and all this stuff. But like, I didn't even know what was going on in my body and that this cancer was growing for several years. So this lack of like trust in my own body that kind of like emerged from thyroid cancer, but then eventually like coming through it and out of it and being able to see like how I was able to survive it
Mhm.
and then turn around and help a lot of people that have gone through all sorts of thyroid issues and cancer issues and, been an advocate in a lot of ways, then it's kind of turned into this positive and that it's like, oh, wow, like, yes, I went through that for a reason. And I have these food allergies and stuff connected to some of that thyroid illness. And I honestly see them as like blessings in disguise now. I'm like, well, at least I have this feedback system with my body and I can tell what it really doesn't like and I can tell that it really does like. And now that's part of my personality is that I'm like, because I've gone through these tough things, like I'm super in tune, with my body. So that's kind of like, I mean, thyroid cancer, I think any kind of like illness like that, it's such a complex thing because
Yeah.
it like, especially when it comes as a surprise. I could ask you, like, would you say that pregnancy loss is a similar experience in that, like, those feelings of like your body not doing what you thought it should?
Oh, 1,000%. I mean, I can totally relate to so much of what you're talking about. Obviously, our experiences are a little bit different, but Kevin and we, I mean, we weren't planning to get pregnant at the time, but I did. And it was, magical. We'd been married for 4 or 5 years already. And, had just turned 30. And so it was like the right time. And rounding out my first trimester, we found out that we lost the pregnancy and it was devastating. And I had just, I'd had an experience with pregnancy loss because my cousin and his wife had lost their baby full term just the year before. And it was very, very hard on all of us. So when I found out that I lost my baby, it was kind of like, "Okay, is this turning into a hat trick? Like, what? This doesn't happen, like, in the universe, like, twice in one go." It just was unbelievably painful, and one of the things that, I didn't appreciate before losing that pregnancy and losing that baby was, I was a first time that was my first pregnancy. And so for, those of you who've had losses and had losses with first pregnancies, it's a little bit different because that's all you know. You don't have the experience of having like a healthy pregnancy and knowing that things are going to be okay. And so for a year plus after that, we started trying and there were a lot of things that ended up happening subsequently. I found out that I had an inflammatory disease called ankylosing spondylitis. It's in the rheumatoid arthritis family, but it affects like my low spine. In some ways, it was like having that pregnancy loss led to my diagnosis because it was the first time in my life that I didn't have exogenous progesterone. Like I wasn't on any type of birth control for the first time in years. And I hadn't been on the pill for a very long time, but I had an IUD that had a little bit of hormone in it. And so what happens when you remove the IUD and you have pregnancy loss is like your progesterone levels just drop because you don't have something stimulating that progesterone release. And progesterone's a natural hormone. You have it throughout your cycle, but it spikes when you get pregnant because it's supposed to. And so when I had my loss and the progesterone just dropped, progesterone masks inflammation in a lot of women because during pregnancy is like a hyperinflamed state. Like anyone that gets pregnant, your whole body goes into this different state of being. And so you release all this progesterone. And one of the purposes is that it like keeps the inflammation down and it's meant for pregnancy. So without it, my inflammation just went haywire, which is part of this disease that I have. So not only was I for the first time like reckoning with the fact that like I had lost this pregnancy, but I lost it because in my head it was my fault. I had this disease that I didn't know about because apparently like it had been brewing for like 10 plus years and there were little things, and I'm not typically like a complainer. Like I was just raised like if there's pain or if you're on your period or if you have a headache, whatever, you can usually push through it and get things done. And I still think that's true to a certain extent, but I think I took it a little too far, not trusting my body, not listening to the cues. So by the time I was diagnosed, I was like, wow, when I look back, there were a lot of different markers of inflammation and things that were wrong. So, in a lot of ways, I felt like if I had just listened to my body, if I had just been a little bit more self aware, maybe I would have known. You start going down that rabbit hole of what if, and it's my fault, and all of this. And so there was this period where I had to, like, one, I had to relearn my body and my body's cues. And two, I had to reckon with the fact that, like, I did feel like my body failed me, and I felt like, it was my fault, and it was a very strange year. Like, I felt like when I look back at, that year where Kevin and I were trying, plus, like, this diagnosis, like, I had to have a couple of procedures during that time. We unfortunately had another miscarriage before we got pregnant successfully with Jude, and it just was like this, like, year-long journey of, like, just relearning how to love my body, and embrace the fact that, like, hopefully, it would do what it needed to do and that I'd have to trust in the process, and that there were very few things I can control at the time other than, like, nourishing myself right and getting rest and getting sleep. And so, again, that, like, sounds like a fairy tale ending. It was not, but you learn to do it a little bit at a time every single day. Definitely shook up even more my image of self and like how I felt about my body and how I felt about the way that I looked. Obviously when you get pregnant, like after you lose the pregnancy, like you're still holding on to like water weight and, a little extra fat in different places. And so it was a very weird time.
I think that, like, as we grow from children to adolescents to young women to women of childbearing age and then some, I feel like we have kind of these different, like, narratives that are a product of all sorts of things, our
Mhm.
culture or advertisement or what our parents have told us and stuff. But I think that a really difficult transition has been that sense of, as a child, you feel like nothing's in your control, and then you become a young adult and you're like, oh, I need to have total self control. I am in control of my life and everything. I should, you know, manipulate everything so that I do all the right things. And, you can even successfully establish that through habits and work and working out and wellness and all this stuff and think that, like, I am doing all the things and checking all the boxes. I'm taking the different things that are going to help my fertility and this and that. And
Yeah.
then it's like,
Oh my
I
god,
think
the
at
fertility
some
journeys.
point, oh my God, like at some point, I feel like almost every person I've talked to has a confrontation with, like, okay, I was doing all the right things and still something blindsided me,
Yes.
whether it is like some kind of medical condition or a loss or even like grief, a loss of another person or an accident. There's always these things that kind of sneak up on us. And I think they're especially jarring when it's something of a physical, nature and that it's like you have to reincorporate it into yourself of body image, of self-esteem and your definition of your personality as it relates to those things.
Yeah. What was one of the most challenging things you think, like, when you went through your diagnosis?
I'd say the most, and this is interesting thinking back on it, but I remember that the thing that made me the saddest about going through that was that so I got diagnosed a month after my husband proposed to me. I had this overwhelming feeling that I had trapped him now, that I was like, "Oh my God, he proposed thinking that I was gonna be a continued version of this other person,
Mhm.
that was healthy and vibrant and successful and young, and now he has a cancer girl, and I it got to the point where I remember sobbing in bed next to him and I was like, "You can call it off. Like you didn't sign up for this." And he just looked at me and he hugged me and he was like, "I would never," he's like, "That's not what this is about." And from that moment forward, I mean, I had those recurring thoughts, but I also look at my diagnosis and I'm like, wow, he stood by my side through every step of that process and it was hard, and we both broke down at different moments and like but looking back, I'm like, wow, like that cancer was like a gift for me to see like what true relationship with someone was about and like commitment and being able to lean on someone was like. But I honestly think I'm like as hard as it was to have the surgery and incorporate the idea of like I had cancer into my sense of self. I'm like, I had this overwhelming fear of like abandonment because of cancer. And like, what does that mean to like my community? Is everyone going to always think this about me? Or, are people not going to want to be committed to someone that has had this kind of medical problem? The other one was like, after I had my thyroid removed, I had to go through a form of radiation where they give you this pill that like makes your body radioactive for a period of time until like the half-life of that like radioactivity decays. And during that period you have to be quarantined and like isolated from other people. So I think it was like 12 feet I had to stay from other people, away from other people at all times. And even in my own home, like, we had to, like we put, like, throwaway sheets on a bed in a guest room and, like, tarps over, like, anything that I would sit on. I had to use disposable, like, plateware and stuff, and I couldn't be anywhere near my husband. And I think that that time period was very, like I mean, it was a very, like, physical representation of this isolation where it's like when you deal with something like cancer, it's so essential to have a support system, but also, like, it can make you really feel like this is something that me and my body are dealing with on our own. And I honestly think I mean, this is a tangent, but I think that motherhood can be like that in some ways too, where it's
Yeah.
like it takes a village, but
It's
it's like, "All
so
right,
internal.
like, this is my experience of it."
The hard thing,
Yeah.
though, with your cancer is that I can relate to motherhood now and, like, we can chop it up. But I
Yeah.
remember when you were going through that, when you went through your diagnosis, it was, like, right at the end of business school for you too, and we were
Yeah.
getting really, really close. We were getting so much traction with Bridget and, like, yeah, this is when we could do in-person events. And I remember you breaking this news to me, and firstly, I was devastated because there's so many unknowns, right? Like, I'm like, "You're my best friend. What do we do? What's gonna happen?" So, that fear was very palpable, like, as your friend. And I remember when you went through treatment and that was a relief, and then you decided to get your thyroid removed and that was a relief. And then you had to do the radiation after. And I remember like thinking, like, wow, like, because we talked while you were in quarantine, and this is before COVID, so this was, like,
Gosh,
quarantine,
on the
pre-quarantine,
OG
where, like, this
quarantine.
is, like, no one yeah, like, nobody knew, like, what this was like at the time, and I just remember
Yeah.
thinking, like, gosh, like, there was so much distance, like, it almost felt like you were, like, in another country even though, like, I knew you were here in the same city, but that we were just you were observing these safety precautions, but it felt like you were in another country, so I can just barely imagine what it felt like to, like, be in your skin at that time, to be the person that had to be, like, so far away. I guess now you can somewhat compare it to, like, "Oh, I had COVID this one time, and so I had to stay away from everybody," but, like, Kevin and I slept in the same bed when we had COVID, like, it's not the same,
Yeah.
and so just, like, the feeling of isolation, I mean,
It's so interesting
yeah.
that you say that because, I have several friends that have also experienced pregnancy loss.
Mhm.
And when they've been going through this, I have similarly felt like an unscalable distance during that experience from my friends. And I also, I feel like I've looked at things and heard people say like what not to say to someone who has lost a
Yeah.
baby. Like that you're almost like walking on eggshells where it's like, oh, I wanna say everything because I love them and I just wanna be there and, like, but I don't wanna say the wrong thing. So then you just kind of feel stuck,
Mhm.
but it's just like this desperate stuckness of, like, I feel like I can't take this away from them. I don't always know what to say, but it's similar where it's just like when you're observing someone kinda going through something like that, it's just like it's hard. Feels like there's a chasm there and it's
Yeah.
and but at this we have this like we have this yearning to like relate to each other even when we're going through like different completely different things that like we can relate to by our own experience, but it's like,
Mhm.
at the end of the day, it's like I don't know what it's like to have lost a baby, and I can only just be there, and listen and feel like we've taken like such a tangent from like body image, but I do think
But it
all of
is,
this
it's
stuff is
part of it. It's part of
yeah,
it,
like
I
at the end
think.
of the day, like our bodies, like you could never be in someone else's skin,
Mhm.
and I
Mhm.
think that I've been on the inside of what was never diagnosed, but like close to an eating disorder. I've been around other people that have had eating disorders, and you think it's similar. Like you look at them and you're like, how could you see things so differently than what everybody else sees? And like, how could you not love your like beautiful soul and body like everyone else loves you? Like, how could you treat your body like same thing, addiction? Like, there's all these different physical things, that people experience in their own skin and
Yeah.
on the outside.
It's so tied the way that we see ourselves is so tied to our emotional experience of living. I think I really appreciate what you said about how different the experience is and just like that feeling of stuckness. I think that's so human. We all have such different experiences, like there are idiosyncrasies, of course. And there's actually a mutual friend of ours who also experienced pregnancy loss. And I remember saying to her one time, and this was after my second loss, like, I feel like you and I are just survived the same war. Like we were
Uh,
both soldiers in the same war. And when you're describing your experience being a thyroid cancer survivor, I almost feel like we're both veterans. They're different wars, but we're both veterans. And so there's a
yeah.
camaraderie there. And I think
Yeah.
really like in the bigger picture, that's probably true for everybody in different ways. It's wild how those inform so much of how we look at ourselves and how different that can be in comparison to how other people see us or how we
Yeah.
see
Well,
ourselves at different stages.
exactly. And I think that that's like such an interesting part because it's like, as especially going through this like pregnancy, you know, birth, postpartum, like wave, which
Hmm.
feels like it takes forever while you're pregnant. But really, when you look back, you're like, holy shit, like my body has been like so many different sizes in like 1 year that like it's hard to like, yeah, yeah, but I'm like at peace. It's like, yes, I am at peace. I am proud of what my body has done. But like, am I comfortable in the fact that like, no, because it's hard to like define what
Yeah.
things change so rapidly that it's like, okay, well, what am I now? Am I pregnant 2 months? Am I recently postpartum? Am I like my boobs the size of Texas and the note is after and it's like sagging and like, there's so many different
Oh my God, I
shapes
know.
that your body
And you
through that
also don't
hormone.
really know, like, I'm at the stage where I'm like, I don't know what my body is gonna do, so I'm, like, just along for the
No,
ride right now.
which is kind of its own beautiful thing.
It's very disorienting. Yes, there's, like, a part of me that looks at this and I'm like, "I'm here for it. I am so proud of what I accomplished." Like, my mom filmed my entire birth, and, I've watched it back, like, a couple times since having Jude, and I'm like, I'm so proud of that experience. Like, I had, like,
Yes.
turned the pain medication off. We just did it. Like, I was so scared pre, labor, and when it came down to it, I just remember, like, breathing through it and being like, everything they do, like, they couldn't get the IV in my arm, and then they wanted to, do a cervical like, it's all uncomfortable, and I remember at each turn being like, "This is really uncomfortable, but this is not gonna be the most painful thing that happens to me today." And that was, like, how I got through it. And then at the end, like, watching my birthing video back, like, I don't know, it's something that I'm very proud of, and I could rewatch the video over and over, to be honest, just because I'm like, wow, I did that. That's me like physically using my body. And I remember at that time just thinking to myself, I exercised through my pregnancy to stay active so that I basically physically trained for the labor because I was like, I know
Yeah.
it's going to be intense. Like, and so when it finally happened, like, I remember just having enough presence at the time to be like, "Okay, now I'm gonna push. I'm gonna push here. I'm gonna breathe through it." Like, I listened to some of the tips that you gave me pre-labor and delivery, so I can, like, look back and be like, "Wow, I really appreciate how that went," because it's giving birth to a baby is wild.
It's wild. It's funny because, like, so my doula I had a doula for my second birth, and she took a similar like a video of like up close, like,
Yeah. Yeah.
the angle of the baby coming
Yeah.
out. And she sent it to me. She's like, "I don't know if you'll wanna watch it right away." But she's like, "But I thought you might it's there if
Yeah.
you want it." She's like, "You can delete it." But I remember I, like, finally sat down. It was, like, a couple weeks after having the baby, and I was like, "I wanna watch it." I'm like, "I'm gonna see it." Like, it was it's and I was like, "Damn, that was, like, really, really cool." I watched it, like, 10 times. I was like,
Yeah.
"This is so cool." I'm like, look at that came out of my body, and it's so beautiful." And, like, it's so and I thought that I was gonna be a lot more, like, squeamish
Yeah.
about it, like, "Ugh," like, "Oh, look what happened to me."
Yeah.
But I to this day, I can watch that video, and I'm like, "Wow, that
Yeah.
is so cool." But at the same time, I think that this is what's so funny about, like, on this topic of, like, body image, is that you can have these, like, super positive
Yeah.
feelings and vibes where, like, one moment I'm like, "I am a rock star," like, "I don't want my body to bounce back because I'm bouncing forward. I am a mom," like, "I'm stronger and better than ever. Why would I wanna be a past version of myself?" Like, this body carried 2 kids, like, it's obviously stronger than it was before, and better and more miraculous, and I have their DNA inside me, like, that's a fun fact that
Yeah.
every time you have a baby their DNA continues to, like, exist inside you, so you're literally bound to them. So anyways, I have these, like, extreme positivity moments. I also I'm proud of the fact that, like, I've worked hard, and I think that my recoveries from pregnancy have been really
Yeah.
good. There's everybody has little things. I'm like, I have an umbilical hernia, like, my little belly button is, like, still a little outy because of a diastasis recti
Mhm.
problem I had with my ab splitting, and I'll zero in on that. I'm like, "God, my belly button's not right yet," and, like, "I don't know if I should wear a bikini because of that," and, like, this and that, and, like, we just hyperfixate on things, and then we
Oh,
can get
yeah.
so negative. I think this is a fun, like, moment to talk about. We were talking about this a little bit offline, but I was like, "Oh, we should save this for the podcast." Like, this idea of body positivity and that whole wave, and how it can actually be kinda toxic to expect that, like, for the example of the word, like, bouncing back.
Mhm.
I've heard both ends of this argument where some people are like, "No, like, bouncing back is a bad thing, and you should never wanna try to get your body back?" And then I hear other people that are like, "A woman should be entitled to work hard on her body after her baby. It's not just all about her having a baby. She can regain her sense of self." I'm like, both of those things are true,
Yeah, I
you
think
know?
it's we've talked about, like, qualities having neutral characteristics before, and I think this is just, like, another really good example of that, where too much positivity is incredibly toxic, and just like in any other avenue, especially when it comes to body positivity, I think it's like so there's 2 sides to this coin, right? And this is purely my opinion. I think using the term like, "Oh, you're gonna bounce back at this certain time," or like, "Oh, you should only gain 25 pounds during your pregnancy because of this." I think there's also, like, a lot of damage to, like, the other end of the spectrum where it's like we have this new wave, and I think we'll get into this in a little bit about, like, like, Ozempic is, like, rampant right now, like, everyone hears about
Yeah.
these weight loss, like, the skinny jabs. And so there's, like, 2 sides to the spectrum where it's like, you're too body positive or we're too on the other end where it's like we're incredibly self-deprecating and, like, need to be, like, size 000, just like, the tabloids wanted us to believe when we were in high school, when it was like, Lindsay Lohan's 98 pounds, and, like, that was, like, all you read, like, the Britney Spears, Paris Hiltons, and everything. It just becomes so toxic, and pregnancy is not immune to that. It's, like, supposed to be this beautiful time for a woman to, like, have her child, and it's sacred and all of these things. But yet, like, when you go into your doctor's appointments, like, all the books still say, like, you should only gain between 25 and 35 pounds, which, yeah, that's great. Like, for my size, you know, sometimes that's possible, but there's plenty of instances where women gain more weight and are perfectly healthy, or like
Yeah.
they're 6 feet tall and they gain 36 pounds or 40 pounds, and like that's
Or
perfectly healthy.
55 pounds like
Yeah,
me.
I'm like, honestly, I think I gained like somewhere in the range of like 40 to 50 pounds, like when I was pregnant, and like it's fluctuated. And honestly, like 20 of those pounds might be in my chest because I went from like like a full B to like an H in like my last trimester, which that's a love-hate relationship because I'm like, these things give my child life and sustenance, but they also make me feel like I'm going to tip over, like they have
Yeah.
taken on a life of their own. I think you're so right in that, like, there's this aspect of neutrality of like, it's right to say, like, I feel so out of sorts in my body. And it's also right to say, like, I want to, aspire to like be healthy again. And it's also right to be like, you know what? This body did so much and I love it. It's a spectrum and none of it's wrong. It's like all informed by this like roller coaster of emotions and experiences that we have to go through living.
Yeah. Even when you're, like, explaining, you're like, "Oh, like, pregnancy is supposed to be this beautiful time for a woman, and it's a symbol of her fertility," and it is a beautiful thing. I think most people will see a pregnant woman and be like, "Oh," you know? But I also think that, when you're pregnant, sometimes, like, you can go through things that are extremely uncomfortable.
Mhm.
A lot of pregnancy for a lot of people, for not all people, but, like, for a lot of people, there are things that make you there's heartburn, there's throwing up, there's changing your sizes, there's uncomfortable boobs, there's all sorts of things, extreme
Diarrhea.
tightness. Diarrhea, like, it's just a
Oh my gosh, your nerve pain.
oh my god, yeah, I had I had herpetic neuralgia, which is, its own thing, but, because I had shingles, before, but I had this, like, really unique, weird nerve pain throughout my pregnancy that I don't have when I'm not pregnant. Like, everybody has, or a lot of people have discomforts. And for me, I was like, oh, like, I don't want to sound like I'm complaining because this is supposed to be a beautiful time for me. And I don't ever want to, like, there are people who can't get pregnant, and I don't want to be seen complaining about my pregnancy because
Yeah,
other people can't have this. And this is a blessing, and I should be happy. But to have all these, I should do this, I should feel this way, I should feel
competing.
solely
Yes.
happy. It's okay to like feel positive and negative in the same little blip, and that it can all exist together. And I mean, in therapy, as I was talking about, like, we're thinking of things in our like toolbox of like, okay, I don't think that I can have like, oh, here's 5 things you can do to fix your self esteem. But like, there are tools where it's like, okay, if I'm struggling, what are some things I can revisit? And one for me has been therapy. I know you and I have talked about, different, wellness or fitness like routines, not as like things to do to fix ourselves, but to, kind of tap back in. But like in therapy, my therapist is like, "Oh, I like to talk a little bit less about, like, body positivity and more about body neutrality." And I think for me, the best, like, form of body neutrality isn't like, "Oh, I don't care about my body," or I'm like, "That would be impossible for me." I'm like, "I am very tied to my physical form." For me, I'm like, body neutrality is like more like appreciation, like taking points where if I'm feeling negative about some part of my body or a size or whatever, finding something to appreciate within that, like how you were talking, you're like, okay, these boobs are extremely uncomfortable, but they are nourishing my child at this point, and they have done this, and actually,
Yeah.
not turning it into positive, but just being like, they're both.
They can
It's a
hit a
lot.
target from like 10 feet away.
All right.
I mean, that's a feat. If there
It
were
is a
if
feat.
there were Olympics
Like
for that.
sprinklers sometimes,
Yeah,
you know?
honestly. I love that your therapist said that, and I think she's totally right about, being neutral. It kind of like brings me back to that first bit that we were talking about, or when you're a child and you're first learning and establishing this relationship with the self, with your physical body, it's so neutral. It's like you're literally looking down most of the time, I think, and wonder at like, hey, I have, fingers, hopefully. I know not everybody has fingers, not everybody's able bodied, but just generally, you discover the things that you are capable of. And there's something really pure about that. And I think, maybe that is like a tool that we need to continue tapping into. It's like when I am feeling insecure or uncomfortable about something, like what's the function? What's the thing that I can be grateful for? What's the thing that works? Because, there is such a thing as toxic positivity. But I think when you curb that with the gratitude angle, it sort of takes the unhealthy out of it. It takes the toxic out of it. And it just starts to become more of that neutral attribute where it's like, no, this is something that is positive. This is the glass being half full part or having something in it. if it's not half full, there's something in it.
Yeah, it's a glass.
Yeah, it's a glass of breast
Yeah.
milk that I shot from across the room.
And then my toddler knocked onto the ground because she degassed. Hey, audience. So, as you can probably tell, our conversation on body image is so layered and we have so much more to get into. So, we decided to split this episode into 2 parts. So, please join us again next week, next Wednesday, and we'll delve into more on body image in part 2. See you there.